Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Great Decisions 2025, which was pointed out to me earlier tonight is not actually our 18th, but our 19th consecutive season. So, I would clap, but I have my hands full, so just what that really means is next year is our 20th. So that's pretty fantastic. I'm sure we'll have sponsors again next year, but this year I would like to thank the sponsors for the 2025 series, which is the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So a big round of applause for all our sponsors. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, as I usually do, I wanted to bring up another program that was coming up at the library that may be of interest. It's not geopolitical in nature, but it is called Extraordinary: Antique Appraisals by Mark Moran. Now what this is kind of like a mini version of Antiques Roadshow, but it's just kind of finding out the history and the value of a single object that you could bring on February 22nd, which is a Saturday, between 11 and 2. So registration is online, or you can just call the front service desk if you're interested. Bring an object in, find out its history, find out if it's worth something or just worth something to you. So that was my announcement for what's coming up on February 22nd. But to this evening, Beth Dougherty is Major Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at Beloit College. She received her MA and PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Since joining the Beloit faculty in 1996, she has taught a broad range of international politics courses, including U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the politics of mass killing, human rights and nationalism, and ethnic conflict. She has received both campus and national awards for innovative teaching. Her main research interests are transitional justice, focusing on the cases of Iraq, Sierra Leone, and Bosnia, human rights, and Iraqi politics. So, without further ado, Professor Beth Dougherty.
Thank you, Tim, for that kind introduction. Is the mic okay where it is? Yeah? Okay, excellent. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. I also have been coming up here for almost 20 years. So yeah, every year. So tonight, I'm going to talk about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. The chapter in the Great Decisions books posed the question of what interests and values do and should the United States have in the Middle East. Now, in some ways, this is a very straightforward question. I mean, any interest in American foreign policy should be something that is able to transcend just one administration. In other words, these should be long-term interests around which everybody more or less agrees, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And so for the United States, for a very long period of time, we've had a very set of interests in the Middle East. So those key interests, one would be, of course, since 9/11, a counterterrorism mission. The United States continues to need to pay attention to the Islamic State and to Al-Qaeda, both of which continue to have affiliates that are operating in the region, and then also to other extremist organizations who either are against American interests or who threaten American allies. So groups like Hamas or Hezbollah. Yeah. Israel's safety and security. This may be one of the last broadly bipartisan issues in all of American foreign policy. It is clear that for both Republicans and Democrats that this is a very important interest for the United States. For the last several decades, the United States has been committed to ensuring that Israel has what's called a qualitative military edge.
What happened? Yeah, it went away.
Qualitative, yeah,
When you tap it, it's going.
yeah, I don't know.
Would you like a handheld mic?
No, I mean, what's best? Yeah, I don't know why it suddenly just,
Sounds like the volume got turned down.
It didn't, so.
do you want me to turn this one off?
Yeah, or I could take it and see if I can get it working.
Okay. Okay. All right, is that better? Maybe not quite that close. Okay. So qualitative military edge just basically means that the United States is committed to ensuring that Israel is stronger than any of its Arab neighbors or Arab neighbors combined. Anytime the United States is going to sell military equipment to an Arab state, Israel has to get better equipment or more equipment, right? So Israel gets the top of the line military equipment from the United States. It's also been a longstanding interest of administrations since the Nixon and Kissinger years to try to find some sort of long-lasting solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. This generally has meant a desire to advance the peace process between Israel and its Arab neighbors. It has been for many decades a U.S. goal for the so-called two-state solution. All right, but there will eventually be a Palestinian state that will be alongside of the sovereign state of Israel. A third key interest is to maintain relationships with our moderate Arab allies. Egypt, which of course signed a peace treaty with Israel during the Carter administration. Jordan, which also has a peace treaty with the Israelis, and then Saudi Arabia. And fourthly, ever since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the coming to power of the Islamic Republic, a key American interest in the Middle East has been to contain Iranian power, and in particular to prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon, right? All administrations have agreed that that kind of proliferation would be profoundly destabilizing for the Middle East. It is not the only issue, obviously, that the United States has with Iran. Iran is seen to threaten a very broad range of American interests that touch on a lot of these others. It supports groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Hashd militia in Iraq, which are all kind of anti-American organizations. Iran has a ballistic missile program in addition to its nuclear program, and it used those ballistic missiles to attack Israel twice in April and October of 2024. Of course, it has a dreadful human rights record. And just in general, the United States sees Iran as a destabilizing force in the Middle East. And then lastly, ensure the freedom of navigation and the free flow of oil from the region, even though the United States doesn't really rely on oil coming out of the Persian Gulf, our allies do. And freedom of navigation is critically important given how many bottlenecks there are in the Middle East. The Straits of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, right? And then through the Suez Canal. Many of you will remember when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, the massive global ramifications that had for trade. There is some concern that China is free riding on the efforts of the United States to ensure freedom of navigation in the Middle East, but this has largely been an American area. In recent decades, beginning probably with the Obama administration, underlying all of these interests has been a sense that the United States needs to compete with China in the Middle East, right? That it is beginning to intrude on American interests. And that the rivalry with China means the United States should probably look away, pivot from the Middle East to Asia to try to confront the Chinese. So that's the sort of an overview of the main American interests. What I want to do tonight is look at the U.S. role in the region and American interests in the Middle East through the lens of two recent, I don't even know what to call them, two recent things that the Trump administration has announced, right? The first is the freeze on foreign aid, coupled with the dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And the second one is Trump's suggestion that the United States, quote unquote, take Gaza, which he announced at the press conference with Bibi Netanyahu only a week ago on Tuesday. Okay. So first, about foreign aid. So the Trump administration issued an executive order on January 20th calling for a 90-day suspension of all U.S. foreign aid with a waiver for the assistance that goes to Israel and to Egypt. Theoretically, there is a waiver for life-saving programs, but as I'll explain in a moment, that has actually in practice has proven not to be the case. The idea is that they were going to freeze the aid and then determine what programs aligned with American interests. But at the same time, they also attacked USAID. The pictures that are up here are they sent workers literally to take the name of the agency off the outside of its building. They covered things in Washington, D.C. that tell people where federal office buildings are. They actually covered over the name of USAID. This is an agency with about 10,000 staff. About 2/3 of them are serving overseas. Most of those staffers were put on administrative leave. They were told they were not to come into the office. Many USAID workers lost their access to email. The payment system for USAID has been shut down, and the website literally disappeared. Several days later, a much truncated version of the USAID website went up on the State Department's website. So that's the first decision that I'm going to talk about. Before I get though, just a few quick facts about foreign aid. First of all, the American public is so badly informed about foreign aid, it's actually comical. Over the years, poll after poll after poll has shown most Americans believe that 25% of the federal budget goes to foreign aid. When asked, they think 10% would be a more reasonable amount of money for the United States to spend overseas. As a percentage of U.S. gross domestic product, our spending on foreign aid is 0.33%. That is 1/3 of 1%. It actually puts us by percentage at the bottom of most of the advanced industrial democracies. The United Nations has said the target for wealthy countries should be about 0.7% of gross domestic product. As a total of, or as a percentage of total federal expenditures into the yearly budget, it's approximately 1%. For comparison, the Department of Defense gets over 13% of the federal budget, or approximately $820.3 billion. USAID was looking at a budget of somewhere between $40 and $60 billion. I would just note on this there we are. The amount of money that in foreign aid that goes to the Middle East is quite substantial. And you can see that it's not just Israel and Egypt. Other Middle Eastern countries are very well represented, either in terms of overall U.S. aid, right? Because the aid to Israel is military, right? Most of the other countries, it's a combination of military and economic aid. But in fiscal year 2023, we sent about $1.7 billion to Jordan, about $1.3 billion to Afghanistan, 1.4 billion to Egypt, 900 million to Syria, 640 million to Lebanon, 593 million to Iraq, and about $112 million for funding to the West Bank and Gaza. So any freeze on foreign aid is, in fact, going to impact the Middle East significantly, even with the waivers for Egypt and Israel. I would also note that even though the United States spends a tiny fraction of its federal budget on foreign aid, because of the size of the U.S. economy, we are responsible for approximately 40% of all humanitarian assistance funding in the entire world. As one person said, the United States is the foundation upon which the House of Humanitarian Assistance has been built. And you can see from this chart, there are a number of different things that you can do with foreign assistance. Some of it is for economic development. I mean, just know the idea behind economic development is if you can improve people's livelihoods where they live, they don't have to migrate, right? And so in the long term, that is, supports U.S. national security. Humanitarian assistance. This is basically often life-saving food, shelter, and water that you bring into either wartime or in the aftermath of disasters. Aid to support democracy building. And some of that is going to programs to ensure, for example, that you're doing counter-extremism programming, right, to ensure that people are not joining groups like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. And then the second decision was not a decision, it's a thought that I want to talk about, has to do with the decision about Gaza. But first, I want to take a step back and just very briefly talk about the notion of the safety and security of Israel as a key American interest. During the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, they took a lot of actions that were very favorable towards Israel, many of them which contravened decades of American policy under previous Democratic and Republican presidents. In December of 2017, the Trump administration formally recognized Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. Of course, East Jerusalem is considered occupied territory, and so it's very controversial to recognize the Israeli claim to the whole city. And then within about a year or so, the United States actually relocated its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In March of 2019, the administration accepted Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. This is an unambiguous violation of international law because the Golan Heights is sovereign Syrian territory that the Israelis seized in the 1967 war. No other country has recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights. In November of 2019, the administration reversed again a policy that the State Department had first issued in 1978, which said that Israeli settlements are inconsistent with international law. And then, in fact, along with that, the ambassador under Trump said around the same time that he believed that Israel had the right to retain at least some of the West Bank, right? And of course, there's a significant number of settlements in the West Bank, and then some also in Golan and East Jerusalem. The Trump administration did or was successful with the Abraham Accords, right, which was the normalization of relations between Israel and several Arab states. I would note that the United Arab Emirates agreed to do this if Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel would not annex the West Bank. There had been a lot of talk about that in Israel, and that was sort of the UAE's price. You can't annex the West Bank. And the Israelis, as of yet, have not done that. So it's Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and then later Sudan, although because of the Sudanese civil war, that agreement actually hasn't been formally ratified. Both countries did sign it. The real hope, the real prize for the Abraham Accords, of course, would be getting Saudi Arabia to sign on. Under the Biden administration, they continue to pursue the Abraham Accords, again, trying to get a normalization with the Saudis. The Biden administration never reversed the U.S. stance on the Golan Heights, but it did in February 2024 return to the older standard that Israeli settlements are inconsistent with international law and place sanctions on a number of Israeli settlers for violent acts that they had undertaken in the West Bank. And of course, as you know, there's absolutely massive support for Israel by the Biden administration in the aftermath of October 7. And that's why really there's a significant amount of continuity, right, between the Biden and Trump administrations around that notion of the importance of the safety and security of Israel. So when the Trump administration came back in, this first thing, the $7.4 billion arms sales, that was already in the works. The Biden administration had already announced in January that the United States was going to provide an additional $8 billion in weapons for the Israelis. What the Trump administration did was allow the shipment of the 2,000-pound bombs that the Biden administration had held back on. Right? And there were also armored bulldozers, which were part of that deal, and those are oftentimes being used in the West Bank to demolish Palestinian housing. So that there's a lot of controversy around the notion of sending armored bulldozers to the Israelis. The Trump administration has appointed individuals to high-ranking positions who are very closely aligned with the far-right ministers in Netanyahu's cabinet. So Elise Stefanik, who is the UN ambassador from the United States, said in her confirmation hearings that she agreed with these ministers that Israel had a biblical right to the West Bank. And then you have Mike Huckabee, who has been named the ambassador to Israel. He has a long history of making statements which basically he doesn't believe settlements are illegal. He says they should just be called communities or neighborhoods. There's no such thing as a West Bank. It should be called Judea and Samaria, its biblical name. He said there's no such thing as a Palestinian. Right? So these are pretty extreme views, even within the general milieu of the United States, where most people are pretty supportive of the state of Israel. The pictures that are on here are troubling. These are from 2018, and Huckabee's done this before. He's laying bricks, right, for new housing in a settlement, which again, under international law, settlements are illegal. Most people see settlements as the major obstacle to finding some kind of political solution between Israel and the Palestinians. So there isn't any doubt whatsoever where Mike Huckabee stands in terms of U.S. policy with respect to Israel. And that brings us to last Tuesday's press conference. The president surprised everyone. Apparently he did tell Netanyahu a little bit right before they went out, but basically what Trump has said in that press conference, and and I can give you some quotes later if people want to know, if you didn't actually watch it. So the idea is the Gaza Strip is unlivable. He repeatedly talked about it as a hellhole, a place of death and destruction, a place that was unlucky, a place that has been demolished. It is a demolition site. The United States will, and this is, the wording has changed depending on what day you're talking about, will take it or own it, or Israel will give it to the United States. Palestinians who live there will be moved elsewhere. And then Gaza will be leveled or cleared out and turned into the Riviera of the Middle East. Between those statements and then the question and answer and a little bit that Trump has elaborated on since then, he and his administration are trying to argue that there will be no U.S. troops involved in Gaza, no boots on the ground, because of course one of the primary things that his foreign policy stood for in his first administration was getting the U.S. out of forever wars in the Middle East. The last thing his supporters want to see are U.S. boots on the ground in Gaza. So no U.S. boots on the ground and no U.S. taxpayer funds. So there's going to be this fabulous development of the Riviera of the Middle East, but we're not going to pay for it. Somebody else is going to do that.
Yeah, like Mexico paid for the wall.
Yes. Right. So first, Gaza. This is what it looked like before the October 7 attacks. It is a tiny little area, but it is extremely densely populated. All right. So I put the statistics up for how big Manitowoc is and how many people live here compared to what you have in Gaza City. And you can see that both of them are about 18 square miles, and whereas there are 35,000 people roughly who live in Manitowoc, there are 650,000 people who live in Gaza City. Prior to October 7th, it was under a blockade. Basically, Israel controlled its borders, controlled its airspace, and controlled the entrance into the water. I will say that Trump is correct in that Gaza is a demolition site, and that the humanitarian conditions there are dire, that it is like hell for the population to be living there. I will say it was somewhat unreal watching him go over and over and over again about how demolished Gaza is, with Benjamin Netanyahu standing right there and absolutely no indication that Israel may have had something to do with the condition of Gaza. It's like, oh, it was demolished. Wonder how that could have happened. No sign that Trump thought the United States bared any responsibility for this, given that the United States was supplying the Israelis with weapons that allowed them to do this. Unfortunately, the United Nations has been estimating that we're looking at decades to remove the rubble and to try and rebuild in Gaza. I read a report today that was saying that there is a great deal of asbestos that had been used in building materials in Gaza, and that is obviously going to be very problematic in terms of a cleanup. As far as the humanitarian situation goes there, would note 90% of Gaza's population of 2.1 million people have been displaced. This is from November, all right? So the red area are all the parts of Gaza where there were evacuation notices from. So only the white areas are where Palestinians ultimately were told by Israel that they were allowed to go. So you have this already densely populated area, all of those people smashed into this one small area. Many people have been displaced 10 times during the course of the fighting. There's great, for anybody who's interested, I really recommend going and looking at what the UN has available. There's all kinds of satellite imagery that you can look at that's got like before and after pictures that will show you maps of damage, etc. But based on those satellite indications, the UN says 92% of the homes and apartments in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. 88% of the schools damaged or destroyed. 68% of the total road network damaged or destroyed. Currently, 1.875 million people need emergency shelter. And it's actually cold there in the winter. And they've been experiencing flooding as well. So these are major difficulties for people right now. Gaza used to grow a lot of its own food, but they are no longer able to do this, right? Obviously, a population that's been massively displaced isn't planting or harvesting anything, but 75% of the cropland, 80% of the orchards and trees, 57% of the greenhouse areas, and 68% of the agricultural wells have been damaged or destroyed. 95% of the cattle are dead. Only 1% of the poultry is still alive. 72% of the fishing fleet has been destroyed. So Gaza and its population are going to be extensively reliant on humanitarian assistance for the foreseeable future. Right now, there is widespread malnutrition and acute food insecurity, with an estimated 345,000 people facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. The ceasefire has allowed a significant amount of humanitarian assistance to enter the Gaza Strip. There had been about 50 trucks a day that were going in the beginning of January. The first 3 days after the ceasefire went into effect, about 2,500 trucks a day were able to get in. So humanitarian assistance is being pushed in at a pretty significant rate, but they are facing a population that has had a year-long episode of chronic food insecurity and high levels of malnutrition. All right, so with all of that background, of a number of different things I want to talk about that are concerns that are both about process and policy that show how these two actions by the Trump administration are going to harm U.S. interests, undermine U.S. credibility and leadership, not just in the Middle East, but all over the world. Yeah. The first one is a process issue, all right? So the way in which these two policies, thoughts were put out there. The first, looking at aid. The planning for the foreign aid freeze was amateurish. Unless you want to believe that this is deliberate destruction on the part of the people that are carrying it out, which may be the case. Right? The directives that were issued were vague and unclear from the beginning. The January 20th order called for a 90-day pause on new foreign assistance obligations and disbursements, which are funds that had already been appropriated but not yet delivered to programs. There was supposedly a waiver for foreign military financing for Israel and Egypt and for emergency food assistance, but they never gave any details about how anybody could apply to get a waiver, right, or what the process for getting a waiver would be. On top of that, on January 24th, the administration sent a notice to all diplomatic and consular officials abroad, which required all grant and contract officers for the U.S. government to immediately issue stop work orders for all existing foreign assistance awards, not just new obligations and disbursements. This meant that work that was already underway with funding provided to organizations and appropriated by Congress, it had to be immediately stopped. January 28th, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, announced an additional emergency humanitarian waiver for implementation of what he said was, quote, existing life-saving humanitarian assistance programs, unquote. But it was still unclear what programs this actually applied to. Many organizations were paralyzed because the consequences of actually spending US money because you thought that you qualified and then finding out that you didn't would be severe. And so without any guidance as to whether or not their programs fit into these categories, everybody just stopped working. PEPFAR, which is the program that was set up under President George W. Bush, which deals with HIV/AIDS and which has saved literally millions of lives and allowed millions of babies to be born free of HIV/AIDS. It received a waiver on February 1st for certain activities, but not for everything that PEPFAR does, and no other waivers have been announced for any other US global health program for things like malaria, tuberculosis, etc. Nothing. In addition to that, they have fired or placed on administrative leave the vast majority of USAID administrators and staff. The vast majority of US humanitarian assistance is dealt with by USAID. State administers some of it, and there's some that is administered, some small pots in other places, but largely our foreign assistance goes through USAID. Practically, almost all humanitarian assistance programs that have US funding have actually ground to a halt. There is no staff to manage the programs. There is nobody to answer any kinds of questions people might have. The USAID website was eliminated. People's email access was cut off. The payment system is closed down. So there are actually about $500 million in contracts to American companies, right? Because the way the contracts work is they spend the money and then they're reimbursed by the US government. So $500 million worth of contracts with no money because the payment system has been stopped. Organizations are afraid to do something that contravenes the order for fear that will mean that they will be cut off in the future. A lot of people have lost their jobs, and not just Americans, right? People overseas as well, right? Who work for small organizations which get money from USAID and oftentimes don't have any other funds. Without that money, they had to furlough their truck drivers, for example. So there are real concerns in Ethiopia, where there are severe food insecurity issues. There's all this aid from the United States sitting in Djibouti, but the transportation workers that would have been paid by USAID aren't being paid, and so that aid isn't moving. Marco Rubio has expressed frustration and anger in public where he says, it's as clear as it could be. We said life-saving assistance. Well, they never defined what life-saving assistance was. There are no lawyers to help anybody figure this out. By the time this 90-day review is up, we may not be able to restart programs, right? Once people have been laid off or have been fired, once organizations have shut down their health clinic, it's not easy to pick those things back up again. Now, we just know if the idea was that this was some sort of efficiency and cost-saving thing, it is really expensive to go back and try to rebuild what you have destroyed. It's a highly inefficient way to go about this. So again, there should have been warning, there should have been consultation, there should have been planning, there should have been definitions. None of those things happened. And the US amounts to 40% of global humanitarian assistance, which means when the United States stops, everything has been affected at the international level. Process with respect to Gaza. Okay, half the time I don't know what to call this. You can't say it's a policy or a proposal. Basically, this was a half-formed idea in Donald Trump's head, which he said in public in front of the world press, right? And basically just without any planning, without any consultation with anyone, without any kind of prep work to put this together, right? Trump didn't even have answers to the most basic questions that people asked him at that press conference that night. They had been discussing moving the Palestinians out of Gaza for several weeks, but the US taking Gaza over was a twist that his own people did not even know about. Right? He was vague in the extreme about what US commitments would be, right? If Palestinians would be allowed to return, etc. This is the kind of thing that if you said this in a meeting, people would run off and say, we're sending it to this committee and these people will talk about it and somebody go ask what they think, etc. But instead, this just got tossed out to the entire international community, again, without any advance warning, consultation, or planning. So both of these things have huge repercussions for US interests, and from a process perspective, were disasters. Secondly, both of these things raise serious and damaging questions about US credibility as a partner. On the aid side, we are destroying 60 years worth of trust and goodwill and partnerships and expertise that have been built up in the humanitarian sector. As I said, the US owes contractors here and abroad for work that has already been done. The organizations have had to lay staff off. People are not going to trust the United States after this. And then with respect to Gaza, in terms of the credibility, the very first thing people started saying was, well, did he really mean that? This is not a game we should be playing with the United States president. Did he mean it? Did he not? Aide spent the next few days, of course, desperately trying to interpret or walk back many of Trump's comments. No, he didn't say that it was possible there would be boots on the ground, for example. Only to have him double down on some of these things. He made more comments on Friday and then again today, which actually trampled over the walkbacks that some of his own people had been trying to do earlier in the week. It's not good for US credibility when the first question anybody has to ask about anything that the United States president said is, well, is he serious? Third commonality with both of these, the administration is simply blowing through laws and norms, right? It does not appear to care that it is violating these. With respect to the foreign aid and USAID in specific, according to the Congressional Research Service, Congress established USAID as an independent agency outside the State Department in the executive branch. The president does not have the authority to abolish it, move it, or consolidate it without congressional approval. Again, when it was created, Congress said outside the State Department. Guess where it is? In the State Department. If the administration believed that USAID was carrying out work that was contrary to American interests, if it didn't like the programming that the Biden administration had instructed the agency to carry out, there are ways to go about fixing that. Okay? But basically, this is a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? You don't like this, you don't like that, and so you literally got rid of the agency. There is a federal injunction that prevented them from firing most of the remaining USAID staff. That's only temporary, so that may actually go forward. But again, they're talking about taking an agency of 10,000 people and putting it down to 300. They have 77 people that they have identified that they say are essential for humanitarian assistance. 77. 12 people for Africa, where the vast majority of U.S. humanitarian aid is going. So the president does not have the authority to do this to USAID without talking to Congress. Congress, of course, is not doing a very good job of defending its constitutional authority. It should have control of the purse. That's a whole other story. With respect to Gaza, similar disregard for fundamental international rules. Israel cannot give Gaza to the United States. The United States can't take Gaza. Gaza is occupying territory belonging to the Palestinian people. It is not Israel's territory, even though they completely control its boundaries, etc. When you combine this with the attitudes of the administration towards talk about annexation of the West Bank, which Trump mentioned in this press conference that he would have something else to say about that in a couple of weeks, it is clear that they are ignoring the fundamental principle of the post-1945 world order. States cannot take territory by force. Right? What message does it send to Russia and to China if you can just take territory because you want it? How will the United States be able to confront China if it goes after Taiwan? It makes it more difficult to confront the Russians vis-a-vis Ukraine, because what the United States basically is saying is, we don't have to pay attention to the rules. We can do whatever we think is in our own national security. But if the United States begins to chop away at the post-1945 world order, which is already under stress from China and Russia, it very well could crumble. Now, we just note the post-1945 world order was a world order established largely by the United States, with the United States at the head, which favored American interests. That is not going to be true of a world order that China is in charge of. But the United States has basically shown through these two things that it doesn't really care about laws and norms. Fourth, I would say in both of these cases, there has been a total lack of empathy shown for the people that are involved, the ordinary people that are involved. In terms of the aid freeze, look, it's very clear, people are literally going to die. Right? There's food assistance that's not getting where it needs to go. Soup kitchens closed down in Sudan, right, when this happened. This freeze harms the world's most vulnerable and desperate people. They have no constituency in the United States and no one to speak up for them. In Gaza, this is made even worse because the United States first under Biden and then under Trump, will not fund the UN Relief and Works Agency, which is the UN agency in charge of Palestinian refugees. It has the largest capacity to do work on the ground in Gaza. Then you think of the treatment of the US citizens who work for USAID. They've been the targets of dehumanizing rhetoric that is really concerning, right? As somebody who studies mass violence, I will tell you this kind of language is chilling because it is often a precursor to violence. Talking about them as criminals, worms, evil, lunatics, a viper's nest of radical left Marxists who hate America, enemies of the people. These are fellow American citizens who worked for the United States government, many of them abroad, right? They have served previously Republican and Democratic presidents, but these are our fellow citizens they're talking about, right? We should not stand for having our fellow citizens disparaged in that way. And if any of you know people who work for the federal government, you know they're just ordinary people, right? Some of them might be incompetent, just like there are incompetent people who work with us everywhere else. But again, calling people worms, or it's a criminal organization, a viper's nest, this is really dangerous language. And then there's just the upheaval and disruption to people's lives. People who were living overseas with their families were given almost no notice. They were told to pack their bags and come home within 30 days. Who were they supposed to contact to find out who was going to pay for this? Where were their kids supposed to go to school? People oftentimes own houses in the United States, but they're overseas, so they're renting them out to somebody else. Again, if you want to cut the staff at USAID, there is a way to go about this that does not involve the level of disruption and cruelty that this policy actually represents. And then in Gaza, in total lack of sympathy or empathy for the people involved. Here's one quote from Trump's press conference. "We will build domains that will ultimately be occupied by the million Palestinians living in Gaza." Okay, there are 2.1 million Palestinians living in Gaza, not 1 million. And secondly, that is the only time in that press conference when he used the word Palestinians, except the very last question when he was directly asked if Palestinians would be allowed to live in Gaza. For the most part, he went through this entire thing talking vaguely about people who live in Gaza. Palestinians don't cease to exist because you don't name them. Palestinians don't cease to exist or lose their right to self-determination because you don't name them. When Caitlin Collins finally asked if Palestinians would be allowed to live in the new Riviera of the Middle East, he said, Palestinians will live there, many people will live there, right? Palestinians also do not want to leave Gaza. This is what he was saying, that they would leave if they had an alternative. This is a picture of Palestinians heading back to North Gaza as soon as the roads were open. It's not that they didn't know what North Gaza looked like. They wanted to go home. The idea that you can just simply say, we're just going to send these people to some undisclosed other location without asking them if they want to go there is terrible. Palestinians are not cargo, right, in some port that you just pick up and move from one place to another. To give you some context here, 2.1 million Palestinians live in Gaza. 2.3 million Americans live in Houston. Can you imagine if somebody said, hey, Houston, pack up. We're sending you someplace else. Not telling you where that's going to be, or who's going to pay for this, right? Or how you're going to get there, or what kind of job you're going to have. Nothing. Okay? It is incredibly disrespectful, especially because this is a population with a traumatic memory of displacement. 1/3 of the people that live in Gaza lived in Gaza in 1948. The other 2/3 of that population are descendants of people who lost their homes in the 1948 war. The people fled the fighting, and then the Israeli government made a decision in the summer of 1948 that no Palestinian would be permitted to go back to the homes they left. Israel confiscated their property, it confiscated their land, and it never allowed them to go home. So no, Palestinians in Gaza don't want to leave because they are afraid that it will be permanent, that they will never be permitted to come home. And lastly, I would just note, look, this amounts to ethnic cleansing, right? The forcible deportation of people from territory is ethnic cleansing. It, again, just a kind of blowing through norms and laws. If this was in any other context, people would have been outraged. Of course, everyone else in the world is outraged about what the administration said here. And then lastly, and then this will be my last point, both of these decisions demonstrate a lack of strategic long-term thinking. Right? Aid is a soft power tool of the United States. It is a key element of the US competition with China. We are ceding the field to China, especially in the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa. Right? Russia has been delighted that the United States is blackening its own reputation here. Okay? How does this freeze on aid and the demolition of USAID support other critical US interests? That money supports the Kurds to keep the ISIS camp in Syria contained. That money has been frozen. Humanitarian and development aid help prevent migration, which prevents people from showing up at the United States southern border. And with respect to Gaza, as far as a lack of strategic long-term thinking, the US did not consult with its moderate Arab allies, right? All of the key American allies in the Middle East have unequivocally voiced opposition to this idea. This is profoundly destabilizing to Jordan in particular. There's already significant pressure in Jordan to lessen its reliance on US assistance. The Gaza idea will only intensify that. This is a demonstration that was there on Friday. It's going to strengthen the hand of the Islamist parties within Jordan, and it threatens Jordanian stability, right? Because a significant percentage of Jordan's population are Palestinian by origin. It's a social identity cleavage which is very sensitive in Jordan, and people oftentimes don't want to talk about it publicly. Plus, Jordan is already hosting a significant number of Syrian refugees. It can't take another 1 million people like that. Egypt also isn't economically capable of absorbing the refugees, and it's obviously worried about strengthening the hand of extremists in the Sinai if that's where you suddenly push 1 million people. Okay. Saudi Arabia issued a statement at 4:41 a.m. Riyadh time, right after the president finished, to make it clear that that it was not going to go along with this. Right? The U.S. apparently is volunteering them to pay for this, but then the U.S. is going to own the investment. No US money, someone else will pay for it, but it will still be ours. If you want to normalize the relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, Saudi Arabia's price is a clear path to a Palestinian state. You don't have to have the Palestinian state, just a path to get there, right? This is not going to lead the Saudis to want to cooperate in any way around that. And then finally, how does this idea solve the larger issue? You still have 3 million Palestinians that live in the occupied West Bank, right? So you solve Gaza, but that's only part of the equation. The deeper question here is, what is the political future of the Palestinian people? And you can't make that question go away with magical thinking, right? About how somebody else is going to magically transport 2 million people away from this area, and then somebody else is magically going to pay for the Riviera of the Middle East that is going to emerge. So, in summary, I would say, with respect to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, buckle up. Right? If the 3 top adjectives for your foreign policy are chaos, confusion, and disruption, that is not a good sign for the stability of the region. And I would be happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
All right, we're going to open things up to questions, as Professor Dougherty said. Olivia will be working the left side of the room. I will be working the right side of the room, and also online.
Just a few cartoons to lighten the mood, right?
So I actually have a question right away from someone online. They were wondering if you could address the dehumanization of the citizens of Gaza and the West Bank by the Western media narrative.
Well, I would say that, well, first, there's very little sympathy for the Palestinian position in the United States historically. I mean, generally, the demographic that's under 40 is more sympathetic, but even there, it's still, I mean, we're not talking about majority sympathy. We're still talking about pretty small amount. There's a tendency to think of Palestinians as terrorists, right? There are a lot of people who are angry about the October 7 attacks, who want to say that everyone who lives in Gaza is a supporter of Hamas, even though half the population is under the age of 18, so they weren't alive when Hamas was elected in 2006. And in 2006, Palestinians were not voting for Hamas to attack Israel on October 7. They were voting against the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. The Islamists were seen as being a better option because they were not likely to engage in fraud and corruption. It was a miscalculation, certainly, but Palestinians have not been given the opportunity to vote again in the Gaza Strip. In any case, there are civilians who live there, women, children, elderly people. They should not be held collectively responsible and collectively punished for the actions of Hamas. We don't condone collective punishment of other populations, but there's a fairly deep well of sympathy for the position that everybody in Gaza deserves what happened to them.
Question over there.
Thank you for your presentation. I just have a simple numbers question. Early on, you mentioned that 0.33% of our budget goes to foreign aid. Is that correct?
0.33% of our gross domestic product.
Okay, and then later
So
on,
the federal expenditure is 1%.
but then later on you mentioned that, is that me or you?
I don't know.
You mentioned that the US provides 40% of global aid.
Yes,
So does that 3.33% amount to 40% of?
it does because the United States economy is so large. Right, and so that's why when you talk about foreign aid, on the one hand, the United States is the most generous country in the world. We give more money than anybody else does. But on a GDP basis, we're not the most generous country. Places like Denmark and Sweden give substantially higher percentage of their gross domestic product to foreign aid than the United States does. But we're the most powerful country with the world's largest economy, so there are expectations that the United States will spend more. I also say, I think, for a long time, there has been an idea out there that the United States was different than most great powers, that it was willing to set up a system where its own power was going to be constrained in the post-World War II era, that it would follow the same rules it wanted everybody else to follow, that maybe the Americans occasionally thought of someone other than their own interests, that there was a generosity in the American people. And certainly Americans have told ourselves that story, right? And so there's a fair amount of shock and despair in the humanitarian aid sector. If you can't rely on the United States, who can you rely on? Right? You can ask other states, well, where's the European Union? Hey, the European Union is giving money. Its economy isn't as big as that of the United States. Right? And again, the United States has been in a position of global leadership since 1945, and it has some, I would argue, responsibilities towards the international community as a result of that.
I got another question online, which was, how much is what is going on in Gaza a revitalization of the concept of manifest destiny, resurging in contemporary times?
Well, there's something sort of neo-imperial about the degree to which the Trump administration, so we're going to take Greenland, and, Panama, and Canada is going to be the 51st state, and we're going to take and own Gaza. Again, these are like with Greenland belongs to Denmark, or with Panama, these are American allies we're threatening. These aren't our enemies, these are our friends. And the Canadians, my God, the Canadians booed the American national anthem during hockey and basketball games last weekend. Canadians, right? It's mind-boggling. Again, they're our friends, they're our closest friends, but we are basically spitting in their face. So yes, there is a kind of a manifest destiny, expansionist notion involved with the Trump administration. There has been talk in other administrations before about Greenland because it is strategically important, but nobody has ever been quite as open as Trump has been about acquiring other people's territory.
I do like that after they booed them singing the national anthem, they invited them back to not boot them singing the national anthem. So this gentleman had a question right here.
Is the acceptance of this within our country, in essence, that Zionism is much like Christian nationalism?
So the primary supporters of Israel, the strongest supporters of Israel in the United States are evangelical Christians. Yes. And that's something that a lot of people don't really realize, and the sense that, Jews support Israel. Well, there aren't that many Jews in the United States. The fraction of the population is tiny. the real support for Israel comes from Christian Zionists, and this is largely evangelical Christians. And of course, evangelicals are a very large portion of Trump's base. And so that's how these things kind of build on top of one another. Right? Somebody like Mike Huckabee, for example, right, who's deeply tied into the evangelical community. He's been taking trips of people to the Holy Land for decades, kind of to show them the religious landscape there. So yes, there's a clear connection in the United States between Christian nationalism and support for Zionism.
I had a question. This so parallels the Hitlerism. This is exactly how he was acting. I mean, even with like the Poland and with France and the takeover. And it's like, I don't know what charisma he had or the way he manipulated the rest of Germany to go along with what he was doing. But he was squeezing them all into these camps. And then, is this what Trump is kind of planning to do? To squeeze all these people into these little camps until they either atrophy or become one of us in his eyes? And then I heard on that news conference, he mentioned Arctic. Okay, he was talking the Northern Hemisphere. It wasn't even North America or whatever. He was talking the Northern Hemisphere. He went from the Arctic all the way down. Arctic, Greenland, Canada. Then he skipped to Panama. He's already trying to grab Gaza. So it's like he's trying to do, I know Hitler was really into Antarctic. The first one who got Antarctica wins. There's something about Antarctica. It's the first one who grabs that wins. But now he's after the whole Northern Hemisphere. And he's squeezing everybody into non-existence. Well, even the American Indians were squeezed into non-existence. They're all going to be in little camps until they atrophy. That's just my view of it.
I think with respect to Gaza, his idea seems to be that the Palestinians will go elsewhere, and he appears to mean Egypt and Jordan, and then they'll build them really nice, beautiful neighborhoods where they'll be happy and free of death and destruction. Again, this is kind of magical thinking, because who's going to build that housing? Where is this territory coming from, et cetera?
Under the Palestinian name or under some other name that isn't quote Palestinian?
There are a lot of people like Mike Huckabee and others on the Christian right who believe Palestinians basically are Arabs, and so therefore they can live in any Arab country. Is that there's only one Jewish state, and there are lots of Arab states, and so it's not a hardship to ask Arabs to live someplace else. You're not asking them to live in somebody else's state. You're just telling them to go to another part of the Arab world. But again, I don't think Trump knows that much about Gaza, right? And since he didn't talk to anyone about this, this is why the press conference was full of these vague, sweeping statements with no details, no facts, no specifics. But the idea is incendiary in the Middle East and has just touched off enormous concern. Then I would say actually the playbook right now seems to be more like what Viktor Orban did to take power in Hungary. Right? That there is a case of severe democratic backsliding where Orban took advantage of aspects of Hungary's system to allow him to take control. And so unless our institutions are able to stand up to this, the executive's power is being expanded significantly at the expense of Congress. And a lot of people are worried that we are going to be face to face with a real constitutional crisis if the courts rule in a way that Trump doesn't like. And then the administration says, well, we're doing it anyway. Right? And so that's where the rubber is going to really hit the road, if it comes to that. But in the meantime, the court cases, it does mean things like, so 2,500 USAID people didn't get fired or put on administrative leave on Friday. But while these cases are winding their way through the court, the damage is being done. And some of that damage is going to take a lot longer to fix than it takes to blow up.
If I'm jumping the line, I apologize. I have a question online and I can't see around the corner. But Anne wondered, what are some things that the audience or other everyday citizens can do to address any of these things right now? It seems like a hopeless situation, but it would be nice to just have your input on it, to what we could do.
So I think the first thing is that people need to contact their members of Congress. Ron Johnson is a Republican senator in Wisconsin. He needs to know that people are unhappy, right? It's already clear that this is a major strategy, that the phone lines at the Senate switchboard in Washington are blowing up, but they need to hear that. Our representatives need to hear from us that we don't like what's happening. But that right now really is the kind of the extent of what we can do. Until people decide that they want to go out and protest the way people did when the Muslim ban first came in. People spontaneously went to airports, right, to show their support for refugees and asylum seekers. But I would say that the very first step and the thing that everybody is capable of doing, call your members of Congress, and in particular, call the Republican members of Congress, because for as much complaining as everybody wants to do about the Democrats lacking strategy and what are they doing and the Democrats are weak, etc., Republicans control the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, right? We have to prevail on Republicans to stand up to the administration. And so, yeah, I wish I had a really great thing that will make people feel energized beyond calling a congressional office, but actually it does matter, and calling is better than writing letters or email. And it's also better if you don't use a script. So some organizations are passing scripts out to people, and so if you want to call, this is what you should say about this issue. But some poor interns answering the phone in the office and they're like, oh my God, this is the 35th time today somebody has said the exact 4 sentences to me. That loses some of its impact. And so you could take a script, but you should personalize it, right? Don't just read whatever it has, or just call and say, I'm worried, I'd like more information, can you explain what's happening, etc. Because the Congress needs to decide that it wants to defend its own prerogatives.
It's true that the United States make this order of international respect, but then if you see, for example, United States, France, and United Kingdom from post-World War II to present times, that is a good reference of the West, as it is called. The 3 countries attacked or invaded 63 countries. Now, you were talking about Russia and China. Russia, after World War II, invaded 6 countries, it bombed 20 cities. China, after World War II, invaded 2 countries. So, it's sort of relative, But one question I have is, what's the political future of Bibi? Because I know that most of the Israeli public is against it, not for the reason that we might think. It's just because of the prisoners, the hostages, that how he handled it. The Israeli newspapers, people are very angry at him. The Israeli newspaper said that he went to eat the favorite restaurant with his wife, and the waiters refused to serve him. That level that he used his bodyguards to bring the food. Is he gonna continue ruling, or is gonna be some change with him?
Well, the U.S. is going to take Gaza and the Palestinians have to leave because it's been demolished. It's a huge gift to Netanyahu. His right wing, the sort of religious settlers that are in his cabinet, and the ones that have resigned over the agreement, the ceasefire agreement, all of these people, they would like to take Gaza, right? They want to put settlers back in Gaza. So the U.S. owning it might not be exactly what they want, but getting rid of the Palestinians is very much what they want. And so on the right, amongst the settler community, this is a very popular idea. Netanyahu's in a stronger position now than he was several months ago, or when the war really first got underway, because Israel's had a string of military successes, right, in Lebanon. It's taken more territory in Syria. It fended off 2 ballistic missile attacks by the Iranians, right? But Netanyahu is still, his cabinet is still reliant on the support of these right-wing settler groups. I think the thing that Netanyahu is most afraid of actually is the accountability that is going to come with calm. That the Israelis are going to investigate what went wrong on October 7th, and that is not going to be good for Netanyahu. There are a lot of signs that Israel let their guard down, that they ignored the signs. They were more interested in what was happening in the West Bank, and they took their eye off of Gaza. And then, as you said, people are angry about the hostages. And the 3 that were released on Saturday, and I'm sure many of you saw the pictures, they were extremely gaunt. There are still hostages that are being held. I don't know if Hamas has said anything today, but earlier they said they were going to, because they say Israel has violated the ceasefire agreement, that they were going to pause the exchange of hostages. Again, if what you want is to get the hostages out of Hamas's control, going on international television and saying the Palestinians are going to be displaced permanently from Gaza is not the way to do that. This was a gift to Netanyahu.
But the Israelis think they are winning the war, because I heard the opposite. The war was a disaster for them. That in Lebanon they couldn't go any further, that they were stopped by Hezbollah, that they could defeat Hamas, and that's what I heard.
Well, it depends on how you want to define victory. If your definition of victory in Gaza is Hamas ceases to exist, that's an impossibility. That's a standard that was never going to be met. But if the standard is, can Hamas pose a threat to Israel now? It can't, right? Israel is in a much better position vis-a-vis Iran, which lost Syria, right? It lost its air defense systems when the Israelis bombed. Hezbollah has been decimated. Its leader has been killed. Hezbollah's weakness allowed the Lebanese, for the first time in several years, to have a president and a prime minister. Okay? And one of the things that US policy should be thinking about right now is what can we do to ensure the Lebanese government has the ability to be able to disarm Hezbollah? What can we do to ensure that the government in Syria remains stable, that it isn't persecuting religious minorities, and that the Islamic State is not revitalizing itself out in the Syrian desert? Foreign aid would be one of the ways that you would do that, right? But the U.S. has kind of shot itself in the foot there. And I'm now thinking about the kind of the lack of the long-term strategic thinking that went into these two ideas.
All right, during the end of the war, this is what always has bothered me. We set up Israel to have a state. Why didn't we at that time?
Between 1948.
Yeah. Why didn't we at that time let Palestinians, because wasn't it part of their territory at that time, and all of a sudden the Israelis got it, and Palestinians were displaced at that time, and they didn't have a state, and now of course we want them to have, before this new government came in, we've always promoted a fact of a two-state solution.
Please, the lab will be closing in 30 minutes. All supercomputers will automatically shut down at 7:45. Yes, please have to recess at the time. Thank you.
You know, and now of course, you know, Trump says, well, the Palestinians need to go away, and we're going to have this land developed, which is wrong. And I just feel it's wrong. But why didn't we at least establish some area for the Palestinians back in 1948? You can't say, oh, here, you have this gift, and throw someone else out, because that's what now things are happening again. Yeah.
So it was the area that is now Israel plus the West Bank and Gaza was mandatory Palestine. It was assigned to Great Britain after World War I. And as part of the mandate, Britain incorporated the Balfour Declaration, which said that a Jewish national home would be established there. But the mandate did not give political rights to the Arab population. It only mentioned their religious and their cultural rights. Long story short, in 1947, the British said, we are out of here. And the United Nations made the decision to partition Palestine, state of Israel and the state of Palestine. The war goes through several stages. Actually, fighting breaks out in 1947 in November, as soon as the partition resolution passes. The war itself, sort of like the beginning of what people call the 1948 war, starts in May when Israel declares its independence. But it defeated all of the combined Arab armies. It drove Palestinians out of territory, or it didn't let people who fled come back, which meant there were many fewer Arabs in what became Israel, but you had about 750 or 760,000 Palestinians who became refugees in 1948. And then you have another wave in 1967. There's an interesting documentary, which I'm pretty certain that you can get online. It was a PBS thing. It's called 1913 Seeds of Conflict, but it actually looks at the early part of the 20th century, and it talks about Zionist immigration from Europe and how that set up the seeds of the conflict. But a lot of people only think about this in terms of like the post-Holocaust era and don't realize just how far back the beginnings of all of this are. And there's some really interesting footage from that area, and most of the dialogue is taken from letters that were written by Arabs and Jews at that time. So it's a good thing for like a before everything else happened. And like I said, I'm pretty sure you can watch it on YouTube.
Over here.
I was just hoping you could give us some sources or resources that we could look into daily that have legitimate, unbiased updates on what Trump does and how that affects us. And I appreciate you saying that we need to get in touch with our representatives as well.
So, The Guardian, which is a UK newspaper, it does not have a paywall. And so you can read that. And so that's usually, as a substitute for the New York Times or the Washington Post, both of which have some issues. These days, The Guardian is a good newspaper. And again, you don't have to have a subscription for that. Some of the think tanks are really useful for kind of specific areas. So the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace today just released a new project on Gaza. It's got a lot of kind of short pieces looking at different aspects of the crisis. And the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Council on Foreign Relations is another place that has accessible short pieces that you can look for. The UN has an enormous amount of information. The Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, which is good if you're looking for maps, humanitarian data, updates. They do like I'm trying to remember what they call them. So there's a humanitarian update. There's one that focuses solely on what kind of assistance has been given, and they're putting them out like once every week or once every 2 weeks. And so, OCHA is an outstanding source, and that would be true like if you were interested in Sudan or pretty much anywhere else where there's a humanitarian crisis. That's kind of a go-to place to get good statistics, maps, etc.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just want to compliment you on.
Hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hold on, Darlene.
They're speaking.
No.
Okay, I'm sorry. I, first of all, just want to compliment you on your tremendous presentation. For me anyway, it has made this all much clearer. And I also want to say that, your statement on contacting our legislators and so on, I think that is vitally important. These are really difficult times in so many ways, and we need to make our opinions known. And you said contact, who you want to influence the most. But I think it's also important to contact the people you're in agreement with, because they need to know that there's support for that position. And I'm big in League of Women Voters, so I do a lot of that whole stuff, And letters to the editor are also important, and sometimes I send the letter to what I've sent to the paper, I also send to the legislators. So, there's a lot of ways to do this and make the public interest known to, and we gotta do that, because if there's ever a time for, keeping hold of our democracy, it's right now.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, just following what Arlene said, thank you so much, because besides contacting our representatives, I think it's very crucial getting information from people like you. And thank you to Great Decisions for bringing this piece of good information to our city. And we should share and invite more people to come to these events so we can hear what is really true. And also, there is no better time than now to be able and to feel comfortable to speak with our families about politics. It always says, oh, we should not speak about politics. We have to, because otherwise we just go through life letting other people take decisions on what is happening. And there is no worse example than the current administration is doing. We believe that we are the leaders of the world, but for how long and for what? We should be looking for peace. We should be looking for economic development for every person in the world. And what we are doing, that's not a leader position. We are going backwards. Thank you.
This will be our last question, and unfortunately, he's also tethered to me right over here.
Well, unfortunately, really unfortunately, there's not enough people hearing your message this evening. You know, I noticed this evening that 53% of Americans approve of Trump. Now, recently I had seen a chart similar to what you have up there of all of the voters that voted for Trump. And if they had an opportunity to do it again, you'll see how it climbed to the top. So, not enough people are hearing this message.
I mean, it's very problematic because just like with USAID, well, first of all, they went after the foreign aid group because it doesn't have a constituency in the United States, right? 2/3 of its workforce actually are overseas, and again, many Americans have grossly inflated ideas of how much money that we are spending. The misinformation and disinformation around this have been stunning, right? There was a Russian-planted story that USAID paid for celebrities to visit Ukraine, which then the celebrities themselves had to come out and say, we never took any money from USAID, but it was all over social media. There was another story that USAID was funding Politico to put positive stories out about the Democrats. Well, Politico runs a subscription service, right? And that's what people were paying for, was a subscription to that. Many Republican members of Congress have subscriptions to Politico Pro. But it makes it sound like the media is in this conspiracy with USAID, or the condom story, right? First it was 50 million, then it was 100 million condoms to Hamas. People believe these things, and you can't go and fact check it because they took the USAID website down. But I do think that they're sort of like expanding circles of consequence and pain that are going to come out of this. If you don't know somebody personally from USAID, then you may not really care about this or hear about it. There's $2 billion in farm aid that USAID helps distribute every year. Those farmers in Iowa, the farm lobby has already started. They're worried about this. What's going to happen to that? People who work in the United States who are USAID adjacent, in other words, they work for an agency or organization that gets some money from USAID, those people are going to start to lose their jobs. And so, unfortunately, I fear that we are going to have to wait until more and more Americans begin to see their own interests being affected by these things. But the misinformation and disinformation that is out there is disheartening because it makes it so hard to have conversations with people because they believe things that fundamentally aren't true, and they do not believe in any of the sources that you would point them to show them like that what they're saying isn't true. And you know, my top suggestion to everybody is call your Congress people. My second one is don't get your news through social media. I'm pretty sure most of you are not doing that, but like all of my students are doing that. You would be shocked how many kids are getting all of their information from social media. Right? I have people asking me the craziest questions, never in class, always after class. They're always kind of like, I heard this on TikTok. And I was like, oh no. But I mean, when it is the president who's out there saying, right, 100 million condoms were bought and sent to Hamas, it's very hard to kind of combat that. But, you know, there's a lot of distortion, hyperbole, and in some cases just flat out lies that are being spread about different policies. Yeah. I wish I had something like funny to end on, something to send everybody off with a good feeling for the evening. But alas, I don't.
And that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your excellent lecture, Professor Dougherty. Remember, if you like the companion publication that goes along with the Great Decision Series, it's available for $15. Cash your check at the main service desk. Hope to see you next week for a story that may very well change from where we are today. Martin Farrell will be talking about the future of NATO and European security. So let's see where that leaves us next week. Thank you all for coming. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
I don't want to.